Edward Gray's boots crunched through the morning frost as he made his way to the chicken coop. The sun hadn't yet crested the horizon, painting the Nebraska sky in watercolor shades of purple and orange. At 68, his joints protested. The cold, but 40 years of farming had taught him that routines didn't care about comfort. "All right, ladies," he called, scattering feed across the ground. The chickens clucked and pecked, their busy movements bringing life to the quiet morning. He collected the eggs with practiced efficiency, placing them into the worn basket he'd used since Sarah passed 5 years ago. The rest of his morning followed its familiar pattern, checking the vegetable garden, maintaining the irrigation system, and tending to his small herd of cattle. Edward found peace in the rhythm of it all, even if the silence sometimes pressed too heavily against his ears. By evening, after a long day's work, Edward settled into his favorite armchair. The leather was cracked and worn, but shaped perfectly to him. He reached for his dog-eared copy of Understanding the Cosmos when a deep rumble of thunder made him pause. The storm rolled in faster than any he'd seen before. Lightning split the sky in bizarre patterns, more geometric than natural. Edward stood at his window, watching the strange display with growing unease. The cattle were secured in the barn, but something about this storm set his nerves on edge. A flash of brilliant, blue-white light erupted from the backfield, followed by a sound like metal tearing. Edward grabbed his raincoat and flashlight, knowing he should check for damage. The rain pelted him as he trudged through the muddy field, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The light had come from behind his eastern cornfield. As he approached, an eerie glow pulsed through the stalks. Edward's heart pounded against his ribs, but curiosity pushed him forward. Pushing through the corn, he stopped dead in his tracks. A crater scarred his field, steam rising from its edges despite the rain, but it was the figure lying at its center that made his breath catch. She looked almost human, except for her silvery blue skin that shimmered even in the dim light. Her hair rippled with colors he couldn't name, like mother-of-pearl caught in sunlight. She lay crumpled on her side, wearing a suit that looked like it was made of liquid metal. "Good Lord," Edward whispered, taking a cautious step forward. The woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of spring leaves. She tried to speak, but her words were unlike anything he'd ever heard. Edward held up his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "You're hurt. Let me help you." She struggled to sit up, revealing a nasty gash along her arm that leaked something phosphorescent. When she tried to stand, her legs buckled. Edward moved without thinking, catching her before she hit the ground. "Easy now," he said softly, surprised by how light she felt in his arms. Her skin was warm, almost hot to the touch, and she trembled like a frightened animal. The woman touched a bracelet on her wrist, pressing something that made it glow. A moment later, her voice came through in halting English. "Help! Dangerous! Following!" She clutched at his coat, her green eyes wide with fear. "Who's following?" "You?" Edward asked, scanning the dark field. The rain had begun to ease, but lightning still flashed overhead, casting strange shadows across the crater. She shook her head frantically, her iridescent hair catching the light. "No time. Please." Her words came through the bracelet with a slight delay, carrying an electronic undertone. Edward's farm sat miles from his nearest neighbors. Whatever or whoever was after her wouldn't find her easily here. He made his decision. My house is just over there. Can you walk? She tried, but swayed dangerously. Without hesitation, Edward scooped her up in his arms. For a moment, he felt 30 years younger, remembering how he'd once carried Sarah across the same field during another storm. The walk back to the house seemed longer with his precious cargo. By the time they reached his back porch, his arms trembled from the effort, but he managed to get her inside without stumbling. He set her gently on his worn couch, noticing how her silvery skin left a faint, luminous trace on his raincoat. "I'm Edward," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "Edward Grey." The woman touched her bracelet again. "Leah," she replied, her voice clearer now through the device. "I apologize for intruding. My ship malfunctioned. Emergency landing." Edward grabbed the first aid kit from his kitchen. "You're bleeding," he said, gesturing to her arm. "May I?" Leah nodded, watching with curious eyes as he cleaned the wound. The phosphorescent fluid that served as her blood glowed brighter when exposed to antiseptic, but the cut began to seal almost immediately. "Remarkable," Edward murmured. Leah's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Advanced healing," she winced, pressing a hand to her side. "Internal damage. Needs time." Edward noticed how her eyes darted to the windows, checking the darkness beyond. "You're safe here," he assured her. "This is private property, miles from anywhere." "They will come," she said softly. "Always come. Must keep moving." "Not tonight," Edward said firmly. "You won't escape anything in this condition." He stood, his knees cracking. "I have a spare room upstairs. Used to be my wife's sewing room." Leah tilted her head, studying him with those impossibly green eyes. "Wife? Where is she?" "Gone," Edward said simply. 5 years now. Cancer." Something in Leah's expression shifted, a flash of understanding that transcended species. "I am sorry for your loss." Edward nodded, surprised by how much the alien's sympathy moved him. "Come on, let's get you settled." He helped her up the stairs, noting how she moved more easily now. The spare room was small but clean, with a twin bed he'd never quite brought himself to get rid of. Sarah's old quilt still covered it, the familiar patterns a stark contrast to his otherworldly guest. "Rest," he said, turning down the covers. "We'll figure things out in the morning." Leah sat on the bed's edge, running her fingers over the quilt's texture. "You are unusual, Edward Grey. Most humans would fear report." "Maybe I'm too old to be afraid," he replied, with a slight smile. "Or maybe I've just seen enough of life to know that kindness shouldn't depend on where someone's from." As he turned to leave, Leah called out, "Edward?" He looked back to see her silver-blue features softened with gratitude. "Thank you." Closing the door, Edward leaned against the wall for a moment, his heart racing with the enormity of what had just happened. In one night, his quiet existence had been completely upended by a beautiful alien fugitive who now slept in his late wife's sewing room. Sarah would have loved this, he thought with a bittersweet smile. She'd always said the stars held secrets worth knowing. Edward barely slept that night. He sat in his armchair downstairs, a loaded shotgun across his lap, watching the darkness through his window. The storm gradually subsided, leaving behind an unsettling stillness. Every creak of the old farmhouse made him tense. Dawn arrived with no sign of pursuit. Edward had just started brewing coffee when he heard soft footsteps on the stairs. Leah appeared in the kitchen doorway, her silvery blue skin catching the morning light in ways that made her seem almost translucent. "Good morning," she said, her translation bracelet making the words clearer than the night before. "Your world's sun feels different from mine." Edward poured 2 cups of coffee. "Different."
"How?" Leah took a sip. Her eyes widened. "Warmer, more yellow."
She took another sip and smiled. "Strong, but interesting," Edward chuckled. "Welcome to Earth." Edward studied Leah as she took another sip of coffee, her expression flickering between fascination and hesitation. Her metal-like suit had somehow repaired itself overnight, though faint traces of damage still marred its surface. "Your people," Edward said, leaning against the counter. "Where are they?" Leah's expression darkened. "Far, very far. A system you cannot see." "With your telescopes." She set the cup down, her fingers trembling slightly. "I am a researcher, studying developing civilizations, but there are others. Hunters." She exhaled slowly. "They do not seek knowledge, only power." Edward felt a surge of protectiveness, a strange but undeniable instinct to shield her. "How long until you're strong enough to travel?" 3 days, maybe 4. My healing requires energy." Her gaze drifted around the kitchen, taking in the simple wooden cabinets, the old radio on the counter, the stacks of farm magazines. "This place reminds me of historical archives. Simple, but functional," Edward chuckled. "Simple's not always bad. Sometimes it's just what you need to hide in plain sight." Leah's hair shifted to a lighter shade, and Edward was beginning to suspect that meant amusement. "You are very logical, Edward Grey, and very kind." She turned toward the window, looking out at the wide stretch of farmland. "May I—"
"Help? With your work?" Edward raised an eyebrow. "You want to help with farm chores?" She nodded. "If I must remain here, I should learn." Edward considered this. Having an alien help with his daily tasks was absurd, but her expression reminded him of Sarah, determined and eager to prove herself when she'd first moved to the farm. "All right," he said, "but we'll need to do something about your appearance if anyone drives by." Leah touched her bracelet, and her form shimmered. When it settled, she looked human. Pale skin, platinum blonde hair. Her suit had transformed into simple jeans and a flannel shirt. Edward blinked. "That's handy." "Holographic camouflage," she explained, though her voice carried a hint of strain. "It requires energy to maintain, but it will serve." "Well then," Edward said, gathering his wits, "let's start with feeding the chickens. They're usually easier to deal with than cattle for beginners." As they walked to the coop, Edward couldn't help but notice how naturally she moved, in her human disguise. Though her green eyes still held that otherworldly gleam, she asked questions about everything: the construction of the coop, the behavior of the chickens, the composition of their feed. "Your species," she mused, watching a hen scratch for insects, "has developed remarkable adaptations to domesticate other creatures for mutual benefit. Very efficient," Edward smirked. "We've had a lot of practice, thousands of years of trial and error." The morning passed in a strange but pleasant rhythm. Leah proved to be a quick learner, though her scientific curiosity led to some amusing moments. She spent 10 minutes analyzing the structure of an egg, and her detailed observations about the photosynthetic processes of his tomato plants made Edward wish he'd paid more attention in high school biology. Around noon,
as they finished weeding. The vegetable garden, the sound of an approaching engine made them both freeze. A pickup truck was kicking up dust on the long dirt road leading to the farm. "Inside," Edward said quietly. "Just in case." But Leia stayed put, her holographic disguise flickering slightly with tension. "No, if I act suspicious, it will draw more attention. Better to appear normal." Edward wasn't sure what normal meant in this situation, but he trusted her instincts. The truck turned out to be Bill Henderson, his nearest neighbor, 3 miles down the road. The old Ford rattled to a stop, and Bill climbed out, eyeing Leah with interest. "Well now, Eddie," Bill called. "Didn't know you had company." Edward forced a smile. "This is Laura, my niece, visiting from Chicago." Leah stepped forward, extending her hand with precise, practiced movements. "Pleased to meet you, sir." Bill shook her hand. "City girl, huh? Getting your hands dirty in Uncle Eddie's garden?" "Yes," Leah replied, her voice smooth but careful. "I find agricultural processes fascinating. The symbiotic relationship between humans and their cultivated species is remarkable for its—" Edward coughed loudly. "Laura's studying biology," he interrupted. "Gets a bit technical sometimes." Bill laughed. "Well, ain't that something? Listen, Eddie, just came by to warn you. Some folks in town were talking about strange lights in the sky last night. Government types asking questions this morning. Thought you should know." Edward felt Leah stiffen beside him. "Thanks for the heads up, Bill. Didn't see anything myself. Probably just the storm playing tricks." Bill nodded but cast another, curious glance at Leah before climbing back into his truck. As the dust settled behind him, Leah's disguise flickered again. "They're closer than I thought," she whispered. "I should leave." "No," Edward said firmly, surprising even himself with the intensity of his response. "You're not strong enough yet, and running now will only draw attention." He gestured toward the house. "Come on, let's get you something to eat. Then I'll show you the root cellar. If anyone comes looking, you'll have a place to hide." Over a lunch of sandwiches, which Leah approached with scientific fascination, Edward found himself talking more than he had in years. He told her about Sarah, about their life on the farm, about his love of astronomy that had filled his shelves with books about space. "Your understanding of the cosmos is limited," Leah said, flipping through one of his books. "But imaginative. Is that a compliment or an insult?" Edward asked, amused. Leah's hair shifted again to that light, pleased shade. "Perhaps both." She moved to the kitchen window, gazing out at the farm. "Your home. It reminds me of something I read." "Oh?" "A concept from your books, Roots." She turned to him, eyes thoughtful. "Humans form attachments to places, to people, even when logic says they should leave." Edward nodded slowly. "Yeah, we get stuck in our ways." Leah's gaze softened. "Or maybe you find something worth staying for." Edward didn't know what to say to that. Before he could respond, a low hum filled the air. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Leah's face went pale. "They've found me." Edward grabbed his shotgun. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Leah shook her head. "You don't understand. The hunters, they track energy signatures. They'll search in a grid pattern. If they come to the house, then we make sure they don't find anything." She looked at him, something unreadable flickering across her face. "You'd risk yourself?" "For me?" Edward met her gaze. "Sometimes the right thing to do is also the craziest thing imaginable." A slow, luminous smile spread across Leah's face. The hum grew louder. Shadows moved along the horizon. Edward tightened his grip on his shotgun. Looks like we're in for one hell of a night. The hum grew louder. The air itself felt charged, as if reality was bending under some unseen force. Edward tightened his grip on his shotgun, scanning the horizon. Shadows flickered in the distance, figures moving with inhuman precision. Leah pressed her fingers to her translation bracelet. "They're here." Her voice was steady, but Edward saw the flicker of fear in her luminous green eyes. "Get to the root cellar," he said. "I'll store them." "No." Leah turned to face him, her shimmering hair catching the dim light of the farmhouse.
"I will not hide any more." Edward clenched his jaw. "Damn it, Leah!" Before he could finish, the air shimmered, and 3 figures materialized near the barn. They weren't human. Their forms were too perfect, too symmetrical. Their skin
gleamed like polished obsidian, and their eyes pulsed with an eerie silver glow. The lead hunter stepped forward. "Researcher Leah," he said in an unnatural harmonic voice, "your unauthorized exodus ends here. The knowledge you carry is too valuable to be left unguarded." Leah squared her shoulders. "I am not property. I will not return." The hunter's expression remained unreadable. "You misunderstand. You have no choice." Edward lifted his shotgun. "Well, see, that's where you're wrong." Before the hunter could react, Edward fired. The blast tore through the night, only to be absorbed by an invisible energy shield around the hunter's body. The creature barely flinched. Edward cocked the gun again. "Well, that's new." The second hunter raised a device that hummed with dark energy. "You are an obstacle, human. Stand down." Edward didn't flinch. Or what? Leah suddenly stepped between them. "No, you won't touch him." The hunters hesitated. "You display emotional attachment," the lead hunter observed. "Illogical. Your biological cycle is corrupting your objectivity." Leah's entire form pulsed with light. "No, you are the ones who lack objectivity."
"You do not understand what I have learned, what I have become." Edward saw something in her shift, a deep, undeniable determination. She touched her bracelet. The air crackled, then the ground trembled. A pulse of energy erupted from Leah's body,
sending the hunters staggering back. Their shields flickered, disrupted by the sheer force of it. The lead hunter's silver eyes widened.
"Impossible!" Leah advanced. "You have underestimated humans. Their capacity for connection, for love, is not weakness. It is power." The hunters raised their weapons, but before they could react, Leah pressed her hand to the bracelet once. More. The energy rippled outward in waves, distorting the very air around them. The hunters screamed an unearthly, mechanical sound before their forms collapsed into flickering light and vanished. Silence fell. The storm had passed. Edward lowered
his shotgun. "What the hell just happened?" Leah exhaled, swaying slightly. "I transmitted a disruptive frequency. One that deactivates their teleportation matrices and disorients their biosignatures. It will take them time to recover." Edward stared
at her. "You just sent them packing?" Leah smiled weakly. "For now." He took a slow step toward her. "And what happens when they come back?" Leah hesitated. "They won't stop looking for me." Edward studied her, his heartbeat steady,
but strong. "Then we don't let them find you," Leah blinked. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Edward said, his voice quieter now, "that you don't have to run anymore." Her glowing eyes searched his face. You would risk everything for me?" Edward let out a slow breath. "Seems to me I already have." Leah's expression softened, and for the first time since she'd crashed into his field, she looked at peace. She took his hand, gently, hesitantly, as if touching him might break something fragile. Edward's rough fingers curled around hers, and somewhere, above them, the stars burned a little brighter. The farmhouse was eerily silent after the hunters vanished. The wind whispered through the trees, and the distant hoot of an owl was the only sound breaking the stillness. Edward still had his shotgun in hand, though he knew it wouldn't have helped much if things had gone differently. Leah leaned against the doorframe, her form shimmering slightly, her breathing shallow. The energy she had used to repel the hunters had taken a toll on her. Edward reached out, steadying her by the arm. "You okay?" She nodded but didn't look at him. "They will regroup. They always do." Edward frowned, scanning the darkened fields. "How long do we have before they come back?" Leah closed her eyes, pressing a hand to her bracelet. "Maybe a day. Maybe less." She exhaled heavily. "I cannot keep running forever." Edward set down his shotgun. "Then don't." Leah finally met his gaze, her vibrant green eyes flickering with uncertainty. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we figure out a way to stop them." "For good." She shook her head. "You don't understand. The hunters are just a small unit. If they report back to the council, more will come, more powerful than before." Edward rubbed his jaw, thinking. "Then we don't give them the chance." Leah stared at him. "You speak as though this is your fight too." Edward's expression hardened. "It is." For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Leah's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. "You are a stubborn man, Edward Grey." "You have no idea," he muttered. Leah straightened, pushing off the doorframe. "Then we must prepare. If I can modify the frequency I used earlier, I may be able to mask my energy signature entirely, hide me from their senses." Edward nodded. "And if that doesn't work?" Leah hesitated. "Then we fight." A chill ran down Edward's spine, but he didn't let it show. He had spent a lifetime defending his land, his home. This time, it wasn't just about the farm. It was about Leah, and he wasn't about to lose her. The next morning, Edward and Leah got to work. Leah spent hours in his barn, modifying her translation bracelet into something more powerful. Edward reinforced the root cellar, turning it into a potential hiding place in case things went south. They barely spoke, but a quiet understanding passed between them. They were in this together. By midday, Leah emerged from the barn, her face grim. "I've done all I can. If they get too close, I'll have to amplify the frequency manually. But that will drain me completely." Edward tightened his grip on the hammer he'd been holding. "Then let's hope it doesn't come to that." Leah studied him for a moment, then reached out and took his hand. "Edward." He turned, surprised by the softness in her voice. "If this doesn't work, if something happens—" She swallowed, her luminous skin dimming slightly. "I want you to know that meeting you changed everything for me." Edward felt his throat tighten. "You—" "Don't have to say that. I do." Her fingers tightened around his. "You are unlike anyone I have ever encountered. Your kindness, your resilience, your refusal to let go of hope." She exhaled. "I never imagined I could feel this way about a human." Edward hesitated for only a second before he reached up and cupped her cheek. She was warm, so impossibly warm. "You're not just some alien, Leah, not to me." Leah's hair shimmered between deep violet and soft blue. She placed a hand over his, pressing into the warmth of his touch. Then the hum returned. Edward's stomach dropped. "They're here," Leah whispered. Edward grabbed his shotgun. "Then let's finish this." The hunters arrived in force. This time there were 6 of them. Their black, metallic forms moved with unnatural grace as they approached the farmhouse, their silver eyes scanning for signs of Leah. Edward and Leah stood side by side on the porch. "You will surrender, researcher," the lead hunter commanded. "Resistance is futile," Leah lifted her chin. "You have no authority over me." The hunter tilted its head. "We disagree." One of the hunters raised a device. Edward had seen enough. He fired. The blast hit the hunter's shield, but this time something was different. The shield flickered, just for a second. Leah seized the opportunity. She pressed her bracelet, sending a shock wave of energy through the air. The hunters staggered. Their forms flickered like unstable holograms. Edward wasted no time. He rushed forward, swinging the butt of his shotgun at the nearest hunter, shattering its device. Sparks flew, and the creature let out an unearthly screech before collapsing into light. 2 down, 4 to go. The remaining hunters adjusted quickly. One raised a weapon toward Edward. Leah threw herself in front of him. A bolt of energy struck her, sending her sprawling to the ground. "Leah!" Edward roared, dropping to his knees beside her. Her skin was flickering between light and shadow, her breath coming in short, pained gasps. The lead hunter loomed over them. "It is over," Edward gritted his teeth, placing himself between the hunter and Leah. "Like hell it is." Then the sky split open. A massive ship descended from the clouds. Not like the hunter's crafts, this one was larger, more powerful, more ancient. The Council. A beam of energy connected with the ground, and from it emerged a being of pure light. It radiated power, its very presence causing the hunters to collapse. To their knees. "Researcher Leah," the entity's voice echoed through the air, vibrating in Edward's bones. "We have received your transmission." Leah, still weak, lifted her head. "That you know the truth." The entity's form shimmered. "We do, and we have judged these hunters unworthy." One by one, the hunters were erased from existence, recalled to wherever they had come from. Edward exhaled, his hands shaking as he helped Leah sit up. The Council being turned toward her. "And you, Leah, what do you choose?" Leah didn't hesitate. She turned to Edward, her eyes soft but full of determination. "I choose Earth." The Council being pulsed with energy. "Then it is done." A golden light washed over Leah. Edward watched, his heart pounding as her form shifted. Her glow dimmed, her features solidified. She became human. Still her, but mortal now. Flesh and blood, bound to earth. Edward swallowed hard. "Leah!" She looked up at him and smiled. "I'm here." Edward didn't wait. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as tightly as he could. The Council ship disappeared into the sky. The night was quiet again. Leah pulled back just enough to cup his face. "No more running," Edward exhaled, resting his forehead against hers. No more running. Above them, the stars burned bright. But for Edward and Lee, the real adventure was just beginning. The storm had passed. The hunters were gone. The council had spoken. But Edward's world had forever changed. Leah was still standing beside him, but now she was human. No shimmering, shifting alien skin, no flickering glow beneath her surface. Just her, as solid and mortal as he was. Edward touched her cheek, his rough fingers tracing over warm skin. "You okay?" Leah nodded slowly. "It feels different." She flexed her fingers, staring at
her hands as if they belonged to someone else.
"I can feel the air, the cold. My body is slower." Edward smirked. "Welcome to aging." She looked up at him, those brilliant green eyes now fully earthbound, but still carrying that same light. "I regret nothing." He swallowed hard, feeling something heavy settle in his chest. She had given up everything for this. For him. Leah stepped closer, reaching for his hand. "Edward." Before she could say more, the distant rumble of an engine cut through the night. Edward's
instincts flared. More trouble?
He turned toward the driveway just as a pair of headlights swept over the farm. A black SUV. "Government," Edward muttered. Of course they'd show up late. Leah stiffened. "Are they a threat?" Edward shook his head. "Not like the
hunters. But they'll want answers." The SUV rolled to a stop. Two men stepped out. They were dressed in dark suits, but unlike the hunters, they were real humans, and Edward recognized the insignia on the windshield. CIA, he sighed.
Great. The lead agent approached cautiously. "Mr. Gray?" Edward crossed his arms. "Depends on who's asking." The man gave him a long, measured look. "I'm Special Agent Henry Caldwell. This is my partner, Agent Ruiz." He gestured toward Leah. "And I assume this is the woman who fell from the sky." Leah straightened beside Edward. "That was a few days ago. I've adjusted." Caldwell arched an eyebrow. "I'll bet." His gaze flicked back to Edward. "Mind if we step inside?" Edward glanced at Leah. She gave him a small nod. He exhaled sharply. "Fine, but if you touch my coffee, we're going to have a problem." Inside, Caldwell and Ruiz took seats at the kitchen table, while Edward poured himself another cup of coffee. Leah sat across from them, her back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. Caldwell set down a folder, thick, worn, filled with classified documents. "We've been monitoring strange activity in this area for the past week. Unidentified aerial phenomena, distorted radio signals, electromagnetic disturbances." He flipped open the folder, revealing satellite images, some blurry, others sharp enough to show the crater where Leah had landed. Ruiz leaned forward. "So, tell us, Mr. Gray, what really happened here?" Edward took a sip of coffee. Storm came through.
"Lightning struck the field. Must have been one hell of a bolt." Ruiz smirked. "Lightning doesn't leave craters," Edward shrugged. "Guess I wouldn't know. I'm just a farmer." Caldwell exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Mr. Gray, we're not here to arrest you. We're here because we're trying to piece together what's been happening and why."
Leah finally spoke. "It is over." Both agents turned to her. "The ones who were after me are gone," she said simply. "You won't find them, you won't detect them, and if you're wise, you won't look for them." Ruiz frowned. And why is that? Leah met his gaze. Because you are not ready for what exists beyond your world. A long silence stretched between them, then Caldwell closed the folder. I believe you. Ruiz blinked. Wait, what? Caldwell stood. I've worked in intelligence long enough to know when I'm out of my depth. He gave Leah a careful look. Whatever you are, whoever you were before, you're human now. And I think that means we should leave you the
hell alone. Ruiz looked between them. We're just going to walk away. Caldwell smirked. You want to explain to the higher-ups how we got involved in an interstellar incident we can't even prove?
He turned back to Edward and Leah. One piece of advice, keep a low profile. The world isn't ready for you. Leah inclined her head. Understood. Caldwell offered Edward a firm handshake. Good luck, Mr. Grey. Edward shook it. You...
Too, Agent? Ruiz muttered something under his breath, but followed Caldwell out. The SUV's headlights disappeared down the road, leaving the farm in quiet darkness once more. Edward finally exhaled. That went better than I expected. Leah
studied him, then smiled. You really don't trust anyone, do you? Not when they wear suits and show up uninvited. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. So, what now? Leah's expression softened. Now? She reached for his hand again, her fingers lacing with his. Now I learn how to be human. Edward squeezed her hand, feeling the warmth
of her touch, the weight of her presence. You're off to a good start. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone anymore. The neighbors had questions about Edward's new wife.
They whispered about how she seemed to glow when she was happy, how her garden grew twice as fast as anyone else's, and how Edward Grey, a man who had spent years alone, suddenly looked younger, happier, alive again. But Edward didn't care about the rumors. Every morning he woke to find Leah sitting by the window, reading Sarah's old books, her platinum blonde hair shining in the sunlight. Every evening they sat on the porch, watching the stars. Do you miss it? Edward asked one night, as they looked up at the sky. Leah tilted her head. Miss what? Your old life? Your world? She considered that for a long moment before shaking her head. No, I thought I would. But everything I ever wanted to...
Learn, I found here. Edward took her hand. And what's that? She smiled.
That love isn't bound by species, or distance, or even time. Edward smirked. That sounds like something out of one of Sarah's books. Leah laughed, leaning into him. Maybe she was right all along. Edward kissed the top of her head, feeling the warmth of her body against his. Sarah would have loved this, he thought. She had always believed the stars held secrets worth knowing. And now one of them was home. Above them, the night sky stretched endless and vast. And for the first time in his life, Edward Grey wasn't just watching the stars. He was living among them.